Well, it's a day late, but thank you for joining us here at the John Thomas Hill Podcast. And this is a podcast that I meant to do yesterday. I really should have done on Wednesday evening when I got home from work, but I wasn't really in the mood to do that right then. But as you're probably well aware by now, Rush Limbaugh is dead. And I do not come here to praise him, I come here to bury him. And there is a phrase that I'm going to look up real quick that I'm going to use. It's actually not Mark Twain that said this. I believe it was Clarence Darrow. I never wished a man dead, but I have read some obituaries with great pleasure. And I will say this. I am very pleased that Rush Limbaugh is no longer living amongst us. Now, this takes a lot for me to say about somebody because when it comes to cancer, I automatically am sympathetic to people generally. I lost my mom to cancer. I lost my grandfather to cancer. I've known too many people to die of cancer. It is a bitch of a disease. It takes away your dignity. It can really completely humiliate you before. And if you're able to survive, it really takes a toll on you. I've just known too many people to die of cancer. So for me to actually, I won't say celebrate his death, but to feel like that justice has been served because a man who I have utmost contempt for has passed away and is now facing judgment in the underworld. Note I said underworld. Why do I say such a strong thing? Well, let me take you back to 1986, 87, around that time, when the Fairness Doctrine, which I've talked about a few times in the past, the Reagan administration had been lobbied long and hard to get rid of it because there were conservatives who felt like that even though the Fairness Doctrine was in the media, basically what the Fairness Doctrine is, for those of you who don't know, basically it's a guarantee, or a requirement, I should say, that broadcast news programs and such, both on radio and television, were to basically give all sides of the story, at least both sides of the story, and basically, if you had an opinion from the left, you had to give an opinion from the right. If you had one side of a story, you had to give the other side of the story. So that's why you used to see on television shows letters from, sort of like letters from the editor, where they would, whoever was the news director would post an opinion. You could give your opinion on it. That was to sort of fulfill that requirement in a sense, because if you, let's say, disagreed with the way a station covered a story, there was a way to fulfill that requirement by having people come on and to give their point of view. Well, there are people who like the idea of only giving you one side of the story. And it's not because of liberal media, it's because they wanted to make conservative media a thing. And in walks Rush Limbaugh, who up until that point had once previously worked for the Kansas City Royals, had not exactly wowed the radio world. I think he was working in Sacramento at the time. He was making a living, but he wasn't exactly rolling in dough. Okay? Well, the fairness doctrine goes away, and we see the rise of conservative media, and guess who's there, ready and willing and able to take advantage of it? Rush freaking Limbaugh. Now, I didn't know about Rush Limbaugh until college in 1989, 90, around that time. And I heard his show, and almost immediately I recognized that this is a man who doesn't believe in telling you all sides of the story. He was a manipulator. He was someone who knew exactly what he was doing. He knew that he was doing it not to benefit the truth, but to benefit himself and his political ideology. Now, you hear occasionally people on the right talk about the so-called liberal media. And there's a reason for that. The reason is they only want one perspective, their own perspective. And this isn't something that's been around for a very long time. This actually really got going in the 80s. The idea that the media had a liberal bias had been around for a long time, but that was mainly because you had conservatives who wanted to paint the media as being sympathetic to communism because they weren't being overly critical of communism the way that the conservatives wanted them to be. They wanted the media to be absolutely 100% gung-ho with it. And to some extent, if you look back at the way television news was run at times, they were very much patriotic. But the point of journalism is to be as objective as you can. You can't be completely 100% objective. You've got opinions. You've got your views. You've got your biases from the way how we grew up, your environment, your college education, blah, 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 blah. You're going to have a subjective point of view to a certain degree. The key to a good journalist is someone who is willing to present all the viewpoints and to present as complete a story as possible. Sometimes that means that the story doesn't look so good for one side. Sometimes the truth is the fact that one side is distorted. Now, you're saying to yourself, well, John, why is this a thing? Is the media truly liberal? Well, not really. Not in the sense of that there is an intentional bias. It is true that pretty much for most of the early decades of national news media and major market media, that the vast majority of people that were employed in that media came from colleges in the East, Ivy League schools around the New York metropolitan area, the metro areas of Washington, Boston, Philadelphia, and whatnot, and they tend to have a more liberal viewpoint than, say, the heart of America. And that's where you get this idea of a liberal bias, because it's not really liberal in the sense of politically liberal. It's the fact that in bigger cities, and throughout history, bigger cities tend to be more liberal than rural areas. That is something that goes across national boundaries, cultural boundaries, religious boundaries. You go to Iran. Tehran is more liberal than the countryside. You go to Tokyo. The major metropolitan areas are going to be more liberal than, say, the countryside, because the countryside tends to be more old-fashioned, it's throughout history, across cultures. And now this is not saying that there aren't metropolitan areas that are more conservative than New York and Los Angeles. It's that the perception that New York and LA dominated media got into the heads of conservatives who wanted rural areas and the so-called flyover states to side more with their perspective instead of the more liberal thinking of the Kennedys in the 60s and whatnot. And the truth is, pretty much the media for up even to this day, national media comes out of two cities, New York, Los Angeles. You get some out of Chicago. You get a little out of Washington, D.C., mainly because it's the nation's capital. Of course, you've got CNN in Atlanta, which I don't know how much they actually still do out of Atlanta anymore. And there's San Francisco and Dallas and Houston and, like I said, Chicago. They do have a little bit. Houston, obviously, because they are home of the space industry. Dallas, of course, because they were a major oil boom town back in the 80s and are still very powerful in the sense of economic development, obviously. Here's the thing about Rush Limbaugh. He came in at a time when there was a need by certain conservative media people to have a voice for their particular viewpoint. And it wasn't traditional Republican politics. Because if you look at the way Reagan was back in 1980 when he won the presidential election, and throughout the 8 years of his reign, to what is considered Republicanism today, Reagan is more of a moderate than anything else by today's standards. Now, he is moderate right. There are still plenty of things he did that were in right field, but there were surprisingly, like with gun control. Now, granted, his view on gun control was heavily influenced by the assassination attempt in March of 1981, where his press secretary, Jim Brady, was severely wounded in the head. That there was a move towards some gun control in the Reagan administration, although they were very conservative about it. They wanted to do something to appease the people who were affected by what happened to Jim Brady, but not honk off the National Rifle Association, which back then was a powerful lobby, but it wasn't anything what it is today, and what it has been for the last, say, 20 years or so. But Rush Limbaugh, the reason I consider him a cancer on American politics and media is because he perfected a technique that basically started a cult, the ditto heads. And he knew how to get inside your head and make you think that he was saying what you wanted to believe. He was a master manipulator. He was someone that took a story and twisted it to his perspective, and the perspective of the people that employed him, because he didn't do it entirely by himself. There were people who wanted to have someone like this to be a part of it. So Rush Limbaugh is not the first conservative radio or television personality. There were others. Morton Downey Jr. was one of them. Although there are some who may argue he wasn't entirely as conservative. He was more of a provocateur. And there were others, a couple of names I can't remember right offhand, that were basically small-time, regionalized, mainly. I think there's one in Southern California, Wally. I can't think of the guy's name. They'll probably come after me after this podcast, but there were a few others. But they were generally small market or small station in major markets where they had an audience, but they didn't have, and they basically skirted the fairness doctrine. They might have a liberal guest every so often and have a very vociferous debate, and so they can get through and get fly under the radar, essentially. Well, that when the fairness doctrine went away, that all requirement of balance went away. And they also perfected the idea of making you think that news, entertainment was actually news, this infotainment. And it's something that's plagued all media. Now, if you look back, and I blame Rush in part, but also blame Rupert Murdoch for this, and plenty of others. If you look back at a CNN report from, say, the mid to late 80s and up until the O.J. Simpson trial in the 90s, you got a pretty good news report. It was fair. It was factual. It gave you plenty of what was going on in the world. It gave it from a neutral position. It was a news company based in America that didn't just talk about the American perspective. So CNN was, at that time, they aren't really now, and I'll explain in just a moment, they were fair and balanced. Now, you say, well, isn't that Fox News's? Fox News wanted to convince you they were fair and balanced because, in truth, they never intended to be that way. Rupert Murdoch and Roger Ailes fully intended for Fox News to be right-wing. And the man they can thank for the success for that was Rush Limbaugh. Rush Limbaugh gave a twist to the day's events and a conservative viewpoint. And this is nothing new. There are politicians on the right like Jesse Helms and Strom Thurmond and a bunch of others who basically decided that liberalism is communism, and thus they twisted a couple of generations' perspectives and turned liberalism, which up until 1970s, 1980s, liberalism was a pretty potent political force in America. It got things done, you know? If you look at our history up until 1980, or say 1970, liberalism did pretty good for the country. But 1980 comes along, Reagan gets elected, and conservatism is born anew. And unfortunately, it's not the kind of conservatism that actually, in my mind, has helped America. It brought about a very virulent nationalism, which there's a difference between nationalism and patriotism. You need to look it up. It basically took patriotism and twisted it to where America can do no wrong, that to criticize anything we do, or in their viewpoint, what anything the Republicans do, or a Republican president does, is being unpatriotic. There's an intent for this. It's easy to compare it's lazy, intellectual laziness to compare someone like Donald Trump to Adolf Hitler. The truth of the matter is, Adolf Hitler, despite his megalomania and despite the fact of his pure evil, Adolf Hitler was pretty smart. He was not a genius by any standards, but he knew how to get things done. Don't get me wrong. I abhor everything about Adolf Hitler. But the man did have brains. He had enough sense to get people that were competent, for the most part, into positions of power. That's why Germany was so effective. That's why Mussolini, who you could better compare Donald Trump to, was so ineffective. You can actually say that, the problem with that thinking, of course, is that Adolf Hitler came about in very difficult circumstances. Germany had just lost World War I. They were paying heavy reparations. Their economy was in the tank. Inflation was through the roof. Things were really desperate. We never got that way in America. And Rush Limbaugh is part of the reason why Donald Trump came about. The reason is because despite the fact that our economy, for the most part, since 1980, if you look at the Wall Street, has done tremendously well, save for the 2008 economic collapse and the recession around 1990, 1991, and the dot-com burst. Pretty much we've done pretty well. And of course, of the pandemic as well. But for the last 41 years, we've done pretty well for ourselves. Except if you are, for lack of a better term, lower class. Basically an average wage earner. Now, there are people in the right wing who knew this was going to come up. They were afraid that if people started realizing that all these tax cuts and all this power that corporations were getting and all the power Wall Street was getting, that there would be a backlash. Well, they needed a way to counter that, because in every other country if you have areas where there's a lot of wage disparity, a lot of income inequality and whatnot, they tend to vote right wing. In England, they tend to vote Labour. In Canada, Liberal. In Australia, they do tend to vote for their version of the Labour Party. Strangely enough, in Australia, they don't have the Labour Party is not spelled with a U, even though the Australian/British version is spelled with a U. But that's long story. Here, that used to be the case, except the moral majority came along, and Jerry Falwell and the like basically made a marriage between religion, fundamentalist, evangelical Christianity, and politics. And Rush Limbaugh took advantage of that. Rush Limbaugh was no idiot, but he was someone who basically got lucky to get a gig and used his gifts of persuasion to convince people to go against their very own interest. He wanted a bogeyman. That bogeyman was liberalism. He, of course, had the perfect bogeyman in Bill Clinton, because Bill Clinton was the new version of the Democratic Party, which wasn't really liberal that in reality. It was more conservative, and in some of Bill Clinton's political opinions, he leaned a little conservative in places. To say Bill Clinton was a liberal is very much mistaken. He was a Southern moderate. Maybe in Arkansas, he was in the South, you can call him a liberal. But if you look at the traditional political spectrum, he was anything but. Rush Limbaugh, of course, fed into this. And, of course, Bill Clinton didn't do himself any favors. Of course, there was the whole Jennifer Flowers thing. Later on, Monica Lewinsky, the frequent scandals and all that plagued his administration, the whole Vince Foster thing, which we still don't know entirely. I don't think they had Vince Foster killed. But I think they may very well have pressured him so much that they put him under such stress that he took his own life. And I don't think you can convict him of murder, but you darn sure could say, in a civil case, you could probably say that they pushed him so far to the breaking point that he took his own life. I'm no fan of the Clintons, even though I'm a Democrat. I lean Democrat. I'm not officially a Democrat. I'm not very fond for political parties, but I tend to lean more that way than anything else. But I'm no fan of the Clintons. But what Rush Limbaugh did was he took that animosity and he infused it for his own benefit and for the benefit of those that wanted to create their own media empires, like Rupert Murdoch and Roger Ailes, who started Fox News in 1996. And of course, Sean Hannity comes along, and a bunch of others come along, to where we're today. Conservative media is very dominant. Now you hear all of a sudden about cancel culture coming up and blah, 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 and saying, well, they're trying to stifle conservatism. Well, if you look at the facts, if this is a way to stifle conservatism, it's failing miserably because it's more omnipresent than ever. Does it mean that Bill O'Reilly was fired from Fox News, but he's got his own gig again. He's back on the air. I would dare say he's probably probably feeling better because he doesn't have the restraints of Fox News anymore. He can do his own thing. Glenn Beck, when he left CNN and CNN Headline News and Fox News, founded his own thing, The Blaze, and has done pretty darn well for himself. Rush Limbaugh helped create all of that. And Rush Limbaugh has helped create this huge disparity between traditional media and conservative media, which is more about feeding their listeners a slanted viewpoint of the news. They have taken the idea that really doesn't hold up to water too well if you look at it from a objective perspective. But they wanted to convince middle America that the CNNs, the NBCs, the ABCs, the CBSs, and all that were part of this huge, vast conspiracy against the middle of America to try and change them some way. First of all, that doesn't exactly hold up to water because these are competing media companies. NBC wants to beat ABC and CBS. CNN wants to beat MSNBC and Fox News. The newspapers are all competing against one another. And even when they are owned by the same company, there are companies that are competing against one another. And another thing that has helped Rush Limbaugh out is the fact that media consolidation in the 90s and the 2000s and so on has meant that we've gone from roughly back in the 1980s, we had 36 or so media companies over news and radio and television. By news, I mean newspapers. Newspapers, radio, and television. To now, there's only 6 major companies that own television stations and news networks and radio networks. And what's disturbing about all of this is the fact that even in the so-called quote-unquote liberal media bias, if you look at what's shown on the network news and such, it isn't as liberal as you think it is. Now, you look at MSNBC and to CNN's primetime lineup, and they tend to be because they have fallen for the Rupert Murdoch poison. The Bill O'Reillys, the Sean Hannitys, and whatnot made it popular to be subjective, to have a slant on the viewpoint. Instead of just simply telling you the news and giving you some analysis about it that gave you more of a rounded perspective of what was going on, they basically told you what to think. It's interesting that conservatives like to complain that liberals are trying to tell them what to think, when in reality, if you look at Bill O'Reilly's back in the day before Tucker Carlson took over, Sean Hannity, Rush Limbaugh, a bunch of others, they're telling their listeners and their viewers what to think. Now, you probably don't know that you're being manipulated when you watch them, but you are. They got this technique from televangelists like Jim Bakker, Jimmy Swaggart, and others. These techniques of shaping and forming opinion. It's something that has taken root like a cancer in CNN and MSNBC. You look at Anderson Cooper, you look at Don Lemon, you look at Chris Cuomo in their primetime lineup. They're trying to do the same thing that Fox is doing. They're trying to make it to where its personality. They've basically taken political / sports talk radio and turned it into a TV show. MSNBC did that way before them. You had Olbermann back in the day, and I like Olbermann. I liked him on SportsCenter. And in general, I tend to view more of his politics more favorably than the conservatives, obviously. I don't agree with everything he stands for, but he found out the key to get more viewers was to be slanted and opinionated, because there was a market out there for people that didn't like Fox News, for people who didn't like the blatant right-wing bias of Fox News. And it's obvious what they were doing. Because the guy that owns them, Rupert Murdoch, was a tabloid publisher. Is still a tabloid publisher. And he will say anything and do anything to get you to buy a paper. He will slant a headline to make it, quote, sexier. Distort it all out of shape and all of that. It's just, this is nothing, for those of us who've studied the media over a few decades, there's nothing new. Rachel Maddow, Larry O'Donnell, Chris Hayes, a few others on MSNBC do the same thing that Fox News does, except it's a liberal slant, not a conservative slant. And the liberals that do this haven't been as good because they didn't get their foot in the door fast enough. By the time they did, conservative media had already established itself, and there was no... There are some, like the Young Turks. There are a few other podcasts out there which liberals did have an advantage for a short time before conservatism took over, basically putting their radio shows on the podcast form and now having, podcast galore out there. But the thing is, with Limbaugh, he was the godfather of all this. He's not the first to use persuasive techniques in media to try and influence. He's not even the first conservative to do this. But he's the first to really do it on a large scale in a syndicated show that took advantage of a rule change in the FCC and ran with it. Now, he tried television back in the 90s and didn't really do that well. But this was before Fox News came along. And Rush Limbaugh is someone who's very shrewd. And it's awfully hard to understand, why would he... remember back in the 2000s when he was on ESPN for a short period of time? I knew that was going to be trouble because he had pledged he would keep politics out of his contributions to NFL programming on ESPN. Well, that's damn near impossible for Rush Limbaugh. He is a political animal. That is why when Rush Limbaugh, the topic of Donovan McNabb came up, Rush Limbaugh said what he said about black quarterbacks, and what happened was he got fired because he violated the very thing he'd said he wouldn't do. Now, this is before ESPN became quote-unquote woke, which I hate that word, but for lack of a better term, for a short time they did tend to flirt with politics. I think they're getting away from that now because they've seen the backlash and they kind of want to get away from that to be more of a traditional sports. I mean, I think I may do later on what I see as the problems with ESPN. And on my other podcast, Rutherford Sports Network. I think I might just do that. But to recap my feelings about Rush Limbaugh is this. He took a format that could very well have been productive and constructive and positive and turned it into a cancer that, and ironically enough, he died of cancer, that has eroded away at traditional media and new media and all of that for 30 some odd years he was on the air. And you look at the media landscape now, it's hard to know who to trust. Back before Rush Limbaugh came around, you trusted, in general, Peter Jennings on ABC, Dan Rather on CBS, Tom Brokaw on NBC. You may not always agree with their takes on things, and some of the commentators you may not always agree with takes on things. But the truth is, there's always been conservative newspapers. There's always been conservatism in media. There's always been an outlet for it. But conservatism, in the modern version of it, is benefiting not the so-called flyover states and not the evangelicals. It's benefiting a certain group of people that want to basically turn America into an oligarchy, to where the robber barons once again rule the country, and the poor folks do as they're told. That is something. If you've studied the robber baron era of the late 1800s, early 1900s in America, you'll understand where I'm coming from with this. And that's part of the problem, is that you've got people that don't understand that this is nothing new. There was yellow journalism during that time, during the robber baron era. There were newspaper people that blatantly used tabloid techniques to slant public opinion against liberalism and labor unions and workers' rights and immigration and other things that tended to be viewed more center-left or liberal, whatever you want to call it. What we're seeing today is nothing new. It's just a different format. And what Rush Limbaugh did, to many extents, he knew about this. He found a way to make himself a lot of money. Now, here's the thing. Did Rush Limbaugh believe everything that Rush Limbaugh preached? We may never know that for certain. But I have always suspected that he never really was more of a politician. Why, if you feel the way he felt, why did he never run for office? If you had the following he had, or he has and still has to a certain extent, why did he not try to run for president? Rush Limbaugh was smart. He knew that if he stayed where he was, he had more influence than any Republican president could possibly ever have. Any more Republican senator, any more Republican congressman or congresswoman could ever have. He had created that empire to where now Hannity's probably going to take that particular torch and run with it. Tucker Carlson, all these others are going to try to fill that void because they know, why should I put myself out there and expose my private life to public scrutiny? And Rush Limbaugh had his skeletons in the closet. But since he didn't run for public office, his followers didn't really care because he never wanted to be a man in power because he already had power. And we could go back and trace the origins of the anti-government feeling among conservatives all the way back to Watergate, when, that all began, ironically enough, under a Republican president who some say was conservative, some say really wasn't conservative, Richard Nixon. And there's a whole history of this, But if you look at Rush Limbaugh's history up until the point he started becoming national, he wasn't really as successful as he liked. He just happened to take advantage of a particular time and made himself successful. In doing so, he hurt, along with the help from plenty of others, don't get me wrong, like Rupert Murdoch and a bunch of others, Roger Ailes, the sense that we could watch a newscast and believe that what we're seeing is true. That the reporters are telling us the truth, giving us objective facts. Now you don't know. There's been so much doubt in it. You don't know about how reliable your local news is. Because in many cases, they're more focused on getting ratings and getting stories that will pop ratings numbers, pop views online, than actual telling the truth. And the reason was Rush Limbaugh found a way to make his show popular, get an audience. People have used that technique in radio as well as television and online, and it's become a detriment to our democracy. So when I say that Rush Limbaugh is a cancer on American politics and media, it's true. But he's not the only one. And the sad part is the traditional media has become afflicted with it. CNN is a shell of its former self because they want, instead of staying true to their Ted Turner's original vision and just being an objective news network, they have become just as bad as Fox. MSNBC is just as bad as Fox. It's no longer news, it's infotainment. It's taking a news story and hammering it to death and getting every talking head about that to argue and fuss about it to where you'll stay and go, oh, I'm going to watch this. It's basically the media version of Jerry Springer. Except instead of talking about husbands cheating, boyfriends cheating on girlfriends with whatever. If you've seen the Springer Show, you know all about how crazy that is. Well, that's basically become American politics. Because they studied that and they realized conflict sells. Getting people on TV to yell at each other sells. It creates ratings points. Not somebody talking about what was going on in China in relation to how they're dealing with Hong Kong and all of this, and their continuing attempt to influence smaller third world countries that we normally would have. And here's the thing. Here's the thing. When all is said and done, Rush Limbaugh will be revered by some, reviled by some, but in the objective analysis, he will be looked at as more of a cancer than a blessing. I don't use that word gingerly. I don't use that word carelessly. But it's true. He was not a great man. He was a charlatan. If he could have done what he did, success in radio, as a liberal, he would have done it. He was a showman. How much he actually believed in what he peddled, we'll never know. He probably convinced himself. But this is someone who knew how to manipulate people, how to sell himself. And he sold his perspective. He found his niche. And he convinced generation upon generation of Americans to fall for his manipulative propaganda. And it has forever changed the media landscape in America for the far worse. We went from Walter Cronkite, Huntley Brinkley, McNeil Lehrer, to Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, Tucker Carlson, Rachel Maddow, Anderson Cooper, Chris Cuomo, and Don Lemon, and all this. Instead of having factual analysis of the news of the day that could actually educate you about, and from a variety of viewpoints, now it's just infotainment. It's getting you to watch a TV show, even to the point of hate watching it, which I'll never understand. Rush Limbaugh created all of that, or at least helped to create all of that. And may he be damned to hell, fire, and brimstone for the rest of his life for doing it. Because what he has done is he has damaged the reputation of all media outlets forever. He wasn't the only one to do that. I'm not going to give him that much credit. But he was a great force in that. He was not a patriotic American. He was not a Christian or anything like that. He was a charlatan. He just was he was out for himself. And if you don't realize that, you've fallen for his poison. You don't understand the manipulation. You don't understand why a lot of people, even in the conservative movement itself, do not like Rush Limbaugh. They respect what he's done for the movement, but there's a clear, obvious history of bigotry against gay people, blacks, Hispanics, Asians, Muslims, Jews, whatnot. And in the coming weeks and months, as conservatives start to really look at Rush Limbaugh's legacy and what he said, there's going to be some distancing. There's going to be a lot of distancing. Much like there'll be with Donald Trump. Are things going to get better now that Rush Limbaugh is dead? No. There's always somebody to take the reins of such a complete and utter mess. We can't put the genie back in the bottle. We can't close Pandora's box. People don't trust the media anymore, either entirely or in part. We automatically assume any traditional news media has a bias, whether it's left, right, or whatever. And the truth is that's the case because they know what sells. It's no longer about telling the truth. It's about getting ratings points, getting clicks on web pages, getting views on YouTube. Conspiracy theories have become more popular than hardened, detailed analysis that may not necessarily be that thrilling. I'm going to give you a couple of movies to watch. Good night and good luck. about Edward Martin Murrow versus Joe McCarthy back in the 1950s. And the movie Network, which is a great movie about the media. It was done in the 1970s, but definitely resonates today. And if you watch those two movies, and it's obvious that Good Night and Good Luck has a liberal bias because it basically throws Joseph McCarthy under the bus without really going into detail as to why McCarthy was popular in the first place. It kind of idolizes Murrow to a certain degree without telling the truth about the fact that Murrow boys were trying to fight a battle against the very thing plaguing the media right now, which is worrying about ratings numbers and not about telling the whole story. So in the end, Rush Limbaugh is dead. And we're going to have to take a long time to recover from the mess he helped create. He wasn't the only one. Let me stress that. We still have Rupert Murdoch and his sons around. We still have tabloid media. We still have the Hannitys. We still have all these other conservative media outlets, Salem, Sinclair, whatnot, that are out there, making you think that there's this vast liberal deep state conspiracy to undermine so-called the heartland of America. When in truth, they're trying to turn back the clock to an era when black people were knew their place, to an era where women were subservient to men, and more importantly, when rich people were in power and the poor had none. That's what it's all about. Turning back the clock. It's about a power play to keep the rich elite powerful and to keep poor people, average working people, down. And Rush Limbaugh is part of the reason why it's been successful. Because it's taken people who should vote for their interests, but in reality, they're voting against it because of the perception that if they vote for the Democrats, they're voting for somebody that is anti-American or anti-Christian or anti-life. Rush Limbaugh was a master manipulator, but he wasn't the only one. He was just good at that job. But history does tend to break down such men. And in the final analysis, once we start really looking at all he said over the course of 30 plus years in radio, and all the columns he's written and all the stuff he said, the mystique will fall away. And we'll realize, hopefully, that he was truly a cancer on the American soul. And it's eat away at what's made this country great to begin with. He's turned us from a progressive, diverse culture to one that has one side, far right-wing, fundamentalist, another progressive, liberal, diverse. And he's poisoned the moat to keep us from bridging that gap. That's what he's done. So I do not come here to praise Rush Limbaugh. I come to bury him. May the maggots, the worms, and whatnot feast upon his body in time, because they will get the nourishment that he never gave his listeners. The truth. All he gave him was a distorted idea of what America should be in his eyes and the eyes of his benefactors. One that goes against the very visions of what Kennedy had, of what Dwight Eisenhower had, of what Franklin Delano Roosevelt had, of what Teddy Roosevelt had, of even Ronald Reagan to a certain extent. That is what's happened. That is why, as far as I'm concerned, Rush Limbaugh should not be allowed to go across the gates of heaven, but instead should go to the other place. And I firmly believe he is in the other place right now, paying for the sins he committed to the American soul and the American spirit in his life. Good night and good luck.